Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Dear viewers, this is another episode of Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path. I'd like to continue on what I was saying in a previous episode about the Office for the International Council of Islamic Information and interaction with students. The Islamic Society in Loughborough University contacted me and said that there were some students doing economics, finance, that wanted an Islamic perspective on it, and could I give it to them? I said, yes, sure. They said, well, can you come and talk to us and them about it and tell what you can do? I said, sure. There had been a link between the Islamic Foundation and Loughborough University because they opened the Markfield Institute of Higher Education and actually were associated with Loughborough University in terms of the degree awarding body, okay, initially. And Islamic economics was one of the topics which was being taught in Markfield Institute of Higher Education, and it was also a topic in Loughborough University in the finance department or whatever it was. So I went along and met these students, and basically the students had been given an assignment or a topic for their final year project. And the topic was that when the gross national product, for want of a better description, reaches a certain value, then people want a greater say, or the citizens want a greater say in the running of the country, and hence they move towards democracy. But this hadn't happened in Muslim countries, and the reason put forward by the people that were propounding this sort of theory was that it was Islam that was holding back democracy in the development of the wealthy countries, wealthy Muslim countries, okay? And so they said to me, can you give us information on this? I said, look, I can give you information, but it's not going to lead to that conclusion. It's going to lead to the opposite. I said, so I think the first thing you have to do is to go back to your professors and ask them if you can prove that it's different to that conclusion is, that assumption is wrong. Will they still accept your project? I said, because you're going to get marked for this. So they came back and they said, the professors are saying that so long as we can justify our conclusions, we can draw any conclusions. We just have to be able to justify them. I said, that's good. I can give you the information you want now. And I did. And after about 3 weeks, they got to their final drafts and they'd given them to me. There was only 2 or 3 students doing this, by the way, but they got to their final drafts. And while I was going through that, I happened to find on the internet that the RAND organization, which is a think tank in the United States, had actually investigated this particular assumption themselves, and they'd come to the conclusion that it was, if anything, it was only a very, very minor part. The greatest part holding back development in any country is attracting foreign investment. And I think China was a very good example of that, because as soon as there was foreign investment in China, it took off, okay? It literally did. And that was the argument that they used, that it wasn't Islam. Islam played a very small, if any, part in democracy, in terms of developing democracy in these countries. It was simply a question of attracting foreign investment. And if you look at the Muslim countries, how much foreign investment is there in them now? After all, the oil companies were nationalized, basically, for instance. So that was knocked on the head. And I gave the students the reference for this RAND report, and they could put that in their abstract or they could put it in their conclusions. It was up to them. Well, the net result was that one student got a first and the other one got a second, a 2-1. Second class, but first grade. So, alhamdulillah, and they were both very happy with that. And the third one, I don't know what happened to him, he didn't come back, but at least I'd done what I could, and I'd done what I said I would. They couldn't prove that particular assumption, because it's actually wrong. But it just shows how people get these ideas, and then they start trumpeting them about as though it means something, okay? And I'll come to another point on those lines in another episode, inshallah. But this was how one got involved in some of the students. This was the undergraduates, but I also was involved with masters and even with PhD students on the Islamic content in what they were doing in some of their works. One person was doing a thesis, Saudi, on women's employment in Saudi Arabia, okay? And of course I'd been in Saudi Arabia, and in the university there was a section where women were employed. So I knew a little bit about it. And also we used to go to tailors, for instance, so I knew about some Saudi businesswomen bringing in tailors and running a tailoring shop, okay, as a business. So I knew something about this, and of course they'd opened branches in banks for women only, run by women only, because of the Saudi businesswomen. So we had quite good discussions on this, and I could help him with some of the information that he needed. But he was much closer to the sources of information than I was, so he could actually get the reports and go through it. But I could help him sort out what was important and the sequencing of it, and whether the Islamic side of it should be a separate chapter or whether it should be brought in along with each of the arguments that he was using as he dealt with them. Anyway, he did 3 or 4 papers in conferences in the 3 years he was doing his PhD, and he was very happy, and so was his professor. So these sort of things came up. And another woman was doing a PhD thesis on women's empowerment and their role in the implementation of Sharia in the Sudan. And I thought this was a very good topic, and I actually liked reading that paper, and I tried to encourage her to write a book out of it, but it hasn't materialized yet. But inshallah, maybe one day, because this was an eye-opener for me, how women could actually get out into various parts of society, and structured society, right up to politics, and actually have an impact. And this is what she was writing about, and I thought that was excellent. It would be a role model almost for another country, but it was never written up, unfortunately. So, but I mean, these are the sort of things that one got involved in, and this is how one could also contribute. Okay, and it was good because I would learn as well. And in fact, a girl phoned me up and she said she was doing a master's and she had written a dissertation. Could she come and discuss it with me? I can't remember what the topic was now, but it was something about politics and Islam. And she came up and we discussed it, and she went away quite happy, and she got a master's, so presumably everything was all well and good, as it were. But it was another role, another function that one could contribute to people who were actually studying. And one of the good things about the undergraduates in Loughborough University was that they ordered a lot of books in the library, modern books on Islam, and mostly to do with economics and finance, but written by Muslims. This was a good thing because they didn't have many books written by Muslims. And this was one of the problems with a lot of university libraries. They have books on Sufism, books on sort of abstract aspects of Islam, but the normal, traditional aspects of Islam, of course, these are not interesting enough for PhD students, and they're not there as background reading to understand what the real Islam is. So they've only got these sort of slants on it from particular perspectives, and this is one of the problems with some of the university libraries, in my opinion. It may be changing now, but when I did a survey of it, I was disappointed by the material in a lot of the universities. Most of it was written by Orientalists or by Westerners, and not even by Muslims. Okay. But I suspect that that's changing, and I did write to all the universities in the UK who had Islamic content in their courses, but not one of them had an online system that they could actually list off the material that they had available. So it was a question I had to go to each library to look at it for myself, and there was no way I could do that from Saudi Arabia. Okay, but did follow up in 1 or 2 universities. I did go to the libraries and looked, and I also went to places like the Mitchell Library in Glasgow when I had some time there, and do some research, and I actually asked them for some books and some papers which they could dig out from their archives. So there is some material available. If anyone knows where to go, then you have the right approach to look for it, and the time, of course. But I come to the end of this part, and inshallah we'll meet again after a short break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear viewers, welcome to another part of Sirat al-Mustaqim, and in this part I'm going to talk a little more about perhaps children's Islamic education, but personal contribution this time. And I've already mentioned in a previous episode how I was invited to talk to some children in a hospital in Riyadh, and I had like a rap session for the boys, and then I started a second class for those students that would be leaving and going back to the West, so that they're prepared to actually stand up for Islam when they got back to the West. That was essentially what the purpose of those talks were, or classes were. When I came back to the UK in 1997, and my wife got into circles that she was talking in, one of the spin-offs was that people used to say to me, look, you're here, you're not doing anything, why don't you talk to some children? And I couldn't really find an answer to say why I couldn't talk to the children, so in fact I started. And particularly in Peterborough, I had a group of about 8 to 10 children up to 13 years old, and I was doing with them what I'd done in the group in Saudi, and that was basically to go through the 5 pillars of Islam and the 6 articles of faith. But what I used to do was to talk to them, get them to discuss what they knew, and then correct it basically, and then ask them to give a presentation on what they'd got out of it. So they would actually draw little posters and make a little presentation, and then they would stand up, and they would either do it individually or in groups. And they enjoyed that because it was much better than just listening to someone talking or them talking all the time. And they could actually be creative in what they were doing and what they were presenting. And it also got them used to talking about Islam, which is a big thing really, I think anyway, for children to be able to talk about their religion. We don't find that very often with so many people, because they don't know enough English or they don't understand enough English from their religion. They can't explain what it is that they've memorized, for instance, and this is a sad part. So anyway, that was one group. And then my wife was also doing Tajweed classes in Slough, and I had about 3 little boys with me there. And at one time I just explained Surah Al-As to them. And afterwards one little boy went back to his mother and said, Mum, you're wasting your time. so she asked him, what did he mean? He explained Surah Al-As to her. So, you know, it's quite encouraging when they can understand what you're telling them, and then they actually try to show that they've understood it. And I think that's good feedback. But how many times do you get it? How many people do it? How many students can do it? How many children can explain even Surah Al-As? Okay. So to me this is the tragedy. Okay. Coming to Islam as I did, I had to learn things and understand them as I went along, otherwise I wouldn't accept them. But being born into the religion, people take things on trust and just memorize it, and that's it, and they don't bother to understand it in most cases. And this, I think, is where we have to come to some sort of terms with ourselves and with others, and make an effort. And so whenever I got the opportunity, I used to do this. I mentioned that I was the chairman of a educational trust, a weekend educational trust, and I used to go along to the youth fellowship meeting, the youth club, whatever you want to call it, on a Saturday morning, and maybe give a talk for half an hour or maybe 20 minutes and get interaction from the people that were listening to me, because the whole idea is to get them to talk about what they understand. It's not so much what you understand, you know that, and they can probably follow that, but it's a question of what do they understand and what are they going to do about that understanding. And that's the real issue of trying to get the message across, I think. And so I used to do half an hour, not every week, maybe once a month, maybe less, but at least make contact and make sure these things were in fact taking place. And then the issue would always come as to how do you get them to really take an interest in what you're doing? How do you motivate them? And one thing, of course, was that nowadays it's possible to find presentations. In one case, the families were going for Umrah, and you can find the performance of Hajj, for instance, on the internet, which is updated each year now. So even the sites are available as to the changes that have taken place. For instance, the Jamarat, the stoning of the devils. So there's a big change there, and this is all on the internet now, and you can actually get all of this in a picture type form that people can not only understand, but they can see it and appreciate it. And you can talk about Umrah before people go and give an example of what they will experience and prepare them for it. And this was another thing that I was doing. If people were going for Umrah or even Hajj, I would give talks on this. In Saudi Arabia I gave talks on this, and they wanted to know the differences between the different types of Hajj, and you explained it. And it actually, when you explain it, it's actually quite simple. People understand it, and alhamdulillah, they have an idea of what to do and also how to be prepared. You know, carry some money with you, for instance. But and also what you considered to be important when there were fires in the past. Now they're all fireproof tents, of course, but in the past where there were fires, people lost all sorts of belongings, including their documents, which were important to them. So you have to have copies, and you have to carry copies, and make sure you've got something with you all the time that can identify you as such. So it's only at trivial points, but it's a question of putting it together when the time comes, because most people are preoccupied with something else, and this is where the problems can come if you haven't thought it out beforehand. And again, you can go through all of this now with easy presentations on PowerPoint, already available on the internet. You can just download them. You don't even have to work at it. And you can even get it in Arabic as well as in English, for instance, and possibly in Urdu as well. I don't know, I haven't looked for that. But I've got some of the presentations myself because they've got better photographs than I've got. And of course that makes a more interesting story and picture book. So, alhamdulillah, all these things are useful, and they're also guides and training aids and educational aids, and we should take advantage of them since they are available for us. And really the whole idea is it's the youth that are the future of Islam, and so it's the education of the youth that's important to us, I think, as the older generation. I think the older people have a role to play in terms of guidance, in terms of experience, in terms of direction, but in terms of energy, it's the youth that have got the energy, and that's what should be harnessed and put into some direction which is for the benefit of the community. And that's not being done enough, in my opinion. The youth are on the streets. We need to get them off the streets. We need to get them in places where they have what we would call a safe environment, where they can talk to people freely, interact with them along the same belief system as themselves, and they can actually become, let's say, good model citizens. Okay, an example: do we do charitable works? Do Muslim children do social functions which benefit the society? For instance, some school kids are picking up rubbish in parks, in public areas. Are our children doing that? Some people are having charities come to the schools and explain the purpose of the charities. Are we doing that with Muslim charities in our Islamic schools? And so on and so forth. How much awareness are we raising in the children for what they can be doing for society, even looking after elderly people? I always remember in my youth that a young man dressed like a teddy boy suddenly went dancing out into the street, waving his arms about to stop the traffic because an elderly woman wanted to cross. And when they went across, he sort of bowed his head and took his hat off and waved to the traffic and went on. And I've still got that image in my mind of this young guy doing that. But I mean, how many of us would do that today? How many Muslims would step into the road and stop the traffic for an elderly person? And of course some of you might say, well, we'd be arrested if we tried now because you have to cross at official crossing places or when the lights are green or something like this. But even then, do we help the elderly? Okay, it's not just a question of crossing a street. It's a question, do we help the elderly? Do we visit lonely people? And so on and so forth. And what's happening now, of course, is that we're even trying to put the elderly people into care homes as if we don't respond to them anymore. So there's a lot of things that we can do, a lot of things we can educate the children to. And in this way, we can actually change the role model image that we have, that people have of Muslim children, that they're not taking part in the society, they're not contributing to the society, and we could be more positive and more constructive. And inshallah, we'll get to it. So let me stop this episode now, and inshallah we'll meet again in the future. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.